The high sun hammered the dust of Redemption Creek into a blinding bone-white powder. It settled on everything, on the sweat-slick backs of weary horses tied to hitching posts, on the brims of hats pulled low over squinting eyes, and on the dead-still silence of a town holding its breath. Inside the first Redemption Bank, the air was thick with the scent of old paper-oiled steel and the metallic tang of fear. Wyatt stood by the teller's window, his shoulders slumped in a posture of deliberate insignificance. He was a broad-shouldered man, built of the same rugged material as the mesas that ringed the valley. But he moved with a quietness that aimed to take up as little space as possible. For 3 years, he had perfected the art of being invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He had come to town for salt and flour, a simple errand. Yet he'd walked into a maelstrom. 4 men held the bank. 3 were brutish and twitchy, their pistols wavering as they herded the cashier and a handful of customers into a corner. But the 4th man, their leader, moved with a chilling theatrical grace. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster that seemed to drink the light. He hummed a tuneless melody as he directed his men, his voice a calm, cultured baritone that was more terrifying than any shout. Wyatt kept his eyes down, his hands held loosely at his sides. He was no longer a lawman. The badge he'd once worn was a phantom weight, a circular burn of memory against his chest. His past was a country he'd fled, and he had no intention of returning. The leader, a man the others called Silas, strolled through the room as if he owned it. He ignored the sacks of money his men were stuffing with bills. His gaze drifted over the terrified faces of the hostages, lingering on each one with an unnerving curiosity, until it settled on Wyatt. A slow smile spread across Silas's face, a predator's smile that did not touch his cold, intelligent eyes. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, his voice cutting through the tense quiet. "Look what the cat dragged in from the wilderness." Wyatt Thorne, the famous Marshal Thorne. Wyatt's blood ran cold. He didn't look up, but he felt the weight of every eye in the room turned to him. His anonymity, the fragile shield he had built around himself, shattered like glass. "I'm not a marshal anymore," Wyatt said, his voice a low rasp, rusty from disuse. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He walked toward Wyatt, his boots clicking a deliberate rhythm on the wooden floorboards. He stopped a foot away, close enough for Wyatt to see the cruel intelligence dancing in his eyes. "Oh, I know," Silas said softly, almost intimately. "I know all about what you are now. A ghost, a hermit, a man running from the fires he started." Wyatt's jaw tightened. The words were a key turning a lock on a room inside him he kept sealed shut. A room filled with smoke screams and the face of his dead wife. "We're not here for the town's money." Marshal Silas continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's just for show. We're here for something much more personal." With a flick of his wrist, Silas's hand darted out, not for Wyatt's gun, but for the pocket of his worn vest. His fingers were quick and sure, closing around the small, heavy object Wyatt always carried. He pulled it out and held it up. It was a silver locket tarnished with age, engraved with a single, elegant S. It swung gently from its chain in the dusty light, a tiny pendulum marking a moment of unbearable violation. Wyatt's breath hitched. Everything inside him screamed to act, to draw the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, to reclaim the last piece of his wife he had left. But he was frozen, trapped by the faces of the innocent people huddled in the corner. Any move he made would get them killed. Sarah Silas read the inscription on the back, his thumb stroking the cool metal. "A pretty name. It's a shame what happened to her. A terrible shame." He looked directly into Wyatt's eyes, the feigned sympathy in his voice, a razor's edge. "But then you always did have a habit of letting the people you care about burn." The targeted cruelty of the act was absolute. This wasn't a robbery. It was a desecration. Silas wasn't a thief. He was a phantom from Wyatt's past, returned to peel back the scars and pour salt in the wounds. "You give that back," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously low. Silas's smile widened. He pocketed the locket. "Come and get it, Marshal." He turned his back on Wyatt, a gesture of supreme contempt, and gestured to his men. "We're done here." The robbers backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the hostages. The moment the doors swung shut, the spell broke. The cashier slumped to the floor, sobbing. A woman screamed, but Wyatt didn't hear them. He stared at the empty doorway, the space where Silas had stood, a cold, hollow cavity opening in his chest. The locket was gone. The carefully constructed piece of his exile was gone. The past was no longer a memory. It was a man with a name and a face, and it had just declared war. For 3 years, Wyatt's cabin had been a sanctuary. Tucked into a fold of the sun-bleached Badlands miles from Redemption Creek, it was a fortress against memory. Its rough-hewn logs were stained dark by sun and storms, and the wind that swept across the vast scrubland was the only constant voice he heard. He had chosen this life of self-imposed exile deliberately as a penance. He was Wyatt Thorne, the U.S. Marshal, who in a single night of fire and misjudgment at Blackwater Canyon had lost everything: his reputation, his spirit, and his wife Sarah. The official report called it a tragedy. A raid on an arms smuggling ring gone wrong, a stray lantern igniting a hidden store of blasting oil. But Wyatt knew the truth. It was his mistake. His informant had been compromised, his plan too aggressive. He had led his men into a trap, and in the ensuing inferno, innocent lives had been consumed, including Sarah's, who had accompanied him on what was supposed to be a routine assignment. The guilt was a physical weight, a shroud he wore every hour of every day. He had left the Marshal's service in disgrace, seeking a place where the name Thorne meant nothing, where he could slowly let himself fade away. Redemption Creek had been that place. The townsfolk were a practical, hardened people who respected a man's privacy, especially when that privacy was wrapped in a cloak of silent sorrow. Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary eyes had seen too many frontier tragedies, left him be. Martha, the saloon owner, with a gaze as sharp as her whiskey, offered him a nod of acknowledgement, but never a question. They saw a broken man and gave him the one thing he craved: distance. But Silas's arrival had shattered that fragile peace. The theft of the locket was not a random act of cruelty. It was a message. Someone from Blackwater Canyon had survived someone who knew his story, his failure, his deepest point of pain. For days after the robbery, Wyatt was a caged animal. He paced the floor of his small cabin, the ghost of Sarah's locket, a cold spot in his pocket. He cleaned his peacemaker, not with the practiced ease of a former lawman, but with the frantic energy of a man preparing for a war he thought was long over. The silence of the prairie was no longer comforting. It was a tense, listening quiet, filled with the echo of Silas's mocking voice. Days bled into one another in a haze of sleeplessness and simmering rage. The need for supplies eventually drove him from his self-imposed prison. He rode to the river to fill his canteens, the simple errand a welcome distraction from the storm in his mind. The sun beat down on the scorched red earth, turning the horizon into a shimmering heat haze, where distant mesas swam like ghosts. He dismounted by the water's edge, the murmur of the current, a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. As he knelt dipping a canteen into the cool, clear water, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the landscape. A ragged, desperate gasp, half sob, half plea, carried on the wind. His head snapped up, his body instantly alert. His gaze swept the riverbank, past the swaying reeds and sun-bleached stones. Then he saw her. A woman huddled amongst the cattails, her dress torn and stained with mud, her shoulders shaking with tremors of exhaustion and fear. He straightened slowly, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt, a habit ingrained by years of caution. She saw the movement and flinched, her eyes wide and haunted, locking onto his. Her lips were cracked, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. "They'll kill me if you don't help," she whispered, the words fragile as spun glass, yet delivered with a desperate intensity that struck him like a physical blow. Wyatt froze. The plea echoed the silent screams from his past, the faces of those he'd failed to protect. He was a man who had sworn off entanglements, who believed he had forfeited the right to intervene in the lives of others. Yet looking at the raw terror in her face, a terror shadowed with a stubborn flicker of defiance, he found himself rooted to the spot. He raised his hand, palm open, a universal sign of peace. "I won't hurt you." She tried to push herself to her feet, but her legs gave way. She collapsed back into the mud with a choked cry of frustration. Shame warred with fear on her face. Wyatt closed the distance, his boots crunching on the gravel bank. Don't take me back," she rasped, shrinking away from his approaching shadow. "Please. They said I was just property now. To be sold." The word property landed like a stone in Wyatt's gut. He had seen the casual cruelty of men who viewed people as possessions, and it stirred a dormant protective instinct he thought had died in the fire. He crouched, bringing himself to her level. "I'm not with them," he said, his voice level and plain, stripped of any false comfort. He unhooked his canteen and offered it to her. She hesitated, her eyes searching his for any sign of deceit. Then, her thirst overriding her fear, she took it with trembling hands. She drank greedily at first, then more slowly, her gaze never leaving his. When she finished, she handed it back, her fingers brushing his. He saw the angry red marks on her wrists, the ghost of ropes or cruel hands. "I can get you out of here," he said, standing and extending his hand. She stared at it, a lifeline offered by a stranger in a merciless world. For a long, silent moment, she wrestled with her decision. Then, with a shuddering breath, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. He pulled her to her feet. She swayed and he caught her, his arm steadying her. The brief contact was electric, a jolt of shared humanity in the desolate landscape. Haunted by his failure to protect Sarah, by the ghosts of Blackwater Canyon, Wyatt knew he couldn't turn away. This was not a choice. It was a reckoning. Wyatt's cabin, once a monument to solitude, now felt crowded with the presence of another soul. He had settled the woman who finally gave her name as Alara into the single room. She moved with the cautious, jerky motions of a cornered fawn, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, as if expecting her pursuers to burst through it at any moment. He gave her a blanket and a place by the hearth, and for 2 days she barely spoke, wrapped in a cocoon of fear and exhaustion. He knew he couldn't keep her hidden forever. They needed food, and he needed information. Leaving her with his rifle and a stern warning not to open the door for anyone, he rode into Redemption Creek. The town felt different. The air, usually thick with lazy afternoon quiet, was now charged with a low hum of anxiety. The bank robbery had left a deep scar. Men gathered in small, grim-faced groups outside the saloon, while women hurried along the boardwalk, clutching their baskets and their children a little tighter. When Wyatt dismounted in front of the general store, the conversation stopped. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Before, he had been a curiosity, a sad story best left alone. Now, in the wake of an attack by outsiders, his own status as a stranger made him an object of suspicion. He ignored the stares and stepped inside. The storekeeper, a balding man named Jed, paused in his task of weighing beans. "Thorn," Jed grunted, his tone clipped. "Need something." "Flour, salt, some canned goods," Wyatt said, his voice flat. Jed measured out the flour with grudging movements. "Heard you've taken in some company." Wyatt's gaze remained steady. "Heard that where?" "Sheriff Miller was asking around. About a woman. Said some folks from out east claim she's their runaway ward. Stole from them, they say." Wyatt's hand, resting on the counter, curled into a fist. So Silas's men had already begun to poison the well. They weren't just hunting Alara. They were assassinating her character, turning the town against her, and by extension, against him. "They're lying," Wyatt stated simply. Jed shrugged, his expression a mixture of distrust and indifference. "Ain't my business. Just telling you what's being said." As Wyatt paid and turned to leave, Sheriff Miller blocked the doorway. The sheriff was a man worn down by the frontier, his face a roadmap of worry lines, his badge tarnished from more than just age. Wyatt Miller said, his voice tired, "We need to talk." They stepped outside into the glare of the afternoon sun. The whispering of the townsfolk followed them. "Those men, the ones looking for that woman you're hiding," Miller began. "They've filed a claim. Say she belongs to them under contract. A debt her late husband owed." "It's a lie, Sheriff. They abused her. They were going to sell her." Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe. But they have papers, Wyatt. And this town is spooked. After what happened at the bank, people are seeing trouble around every corner. A man like you, a former marshal, hiding a runaway. It doesn't look good. Since when does the law in this town depend on how things look?" Wyatt shot back, a spark of his old fire flashing in his eyes. "Since 4 armed men rode in and reminded us how fragile things are." Miller's voice rose, cracking with frustration. "I'm asking you, Wyatt, for the good of the town, turn her over. Let the law sort it out." "The law," Wyatt gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Their law is the end of a rope or the bottom of a bottle. I'm not sending her back to that." "Then you're making yourself an accomplice," the sheriff warned. "You're choosing her over this town. Don't expect any help from the folks here when those men decide to stop asking nicely." The sheriff's words were a clear line drawn in the dust. Wyatt was on one side and the rest of Redemption Creek was on the other. He loaded his supplies, the weight of the town's judgment heavy on his shoulders, and rode out feeling more isolated than ever before. When he returned to the cabin, Ilara was on the porch, nervously twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "In town, the whispers." Wyatt nodded, setting the sacks down. "They'll find another story to tell tomorrow. But this one is about me," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm bringing this trouble on you. I should leave." And go where he countered, his tone sharper than he intended. He softened it. "Running won't solve anything. We stand here, together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, unexpected and powerful. It was a concept neither of them had known for a long time. That evening, the tension that had defined their cohabitation began to melt away, replaced by a fragile alliance. As he sat cleaning his revolver, she began to talk, her voice, at first fragmented and fearful, then growing stronger as she unburdened herself. She spoke of her arranged marriage, of a husband who was kind but weak, and of his cruel family who saw her as chattel after his death. In return, Wyatt found himself sharing pieces of his own shattered life. He didn't speak of the fire or the full extent of his failure, but he told her of Sarah, of his life as a marshal, and of the hollowing grief that had driven him into the wilderness. They were two people defined by their ghosts, finding a strange comfort in the shared landscape of their sorrow. He took her out behind the cabin and taught her how to hold and fire the peacemaker. Her hands shook at first, but with his steady guidance she learned. The act of holding the weapon, of feeling its power, seemed to straighten her spine, to burn away some of the fear that had hunched her shoulders. As days turned into a week, a quiet routine settled over the cabin. But outside their small haven, the pressure was mounting. Silas's men were no longer just asking questions in town. They started riding the perimeter of Wyatt's land, their presence a constant, silent threat. They never crossed his property line, but their watchful eyes were always there, a promise of violence to come. Wyatt began his own investigation. He watched them from a distance through his field glasses. He saw one of the men reshoeing a horse and noticed the brand on its flank, a stylized bird's foot, 3 lines radiating from a single point. The crow's foot brand. A cold dread snaked up his spine. It was the brand used by the Blackwater Canyon smugglers. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. One evening, one of Silas's men, a loudmouth named Cale, got drunk in Martha's saloon. Wyatt, nursing a rare whiskey in a dark corner, listened as Cale boasted to a nervous-looking farmer. "Our boss, he's a man who believes in settling old accounts," Cale slurred. "He says some fires you just can't put out. They just keep burning until everything is ash. Some fires you just can't put out." It was a phrase Wyatt's old commanding officer used to say. A phrase only someone intimately familiar with the Marshal's service or those they hunted would know. The robbery, the locket, the crow's foot brand, and now this phrase. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. This wasn't about Alara. She was just a pawn. This was about him. This was about Blackwater Canyon. And the man leading them was not just some cruel opportunist. He was a ghost. The certainty settled in Wyatt's gut like a block of ice. He needed confirmation, a name to put to the face of his past. He knew he couldn't get it in town. He had to force their hand. He waited for 2 days, watching the movements of Silas's men from the high ridge behind his cabin. He learned their patterns. 2 rode the north perimeter, 1 the south. The 4th, the drunkard Cale, often rode alone toward the old abandoned way station to the west. On the 3rd day, under the cover of a bruised twilight sky, he made his move. He left Alara at the cabin, her face pale with worry, but her grip on the rifle steady. "Don't hesitate," he told her. "You see anyone but me, you shoot." She nodded, her eyes filled with a trust that both fortified and terrified him. He circled around through the arroyos, his horse's hooves muffled by the sandy ground, and came up behind the way station. As expected, Cale was there, taking a long pull from a flask, his horse tied loosely to a rotted post. Wyatt dismounted, moving with the lethal silence of his marshal, days a ghost of the man he used to be. Cale never heard him coming. One moment he was staring at the dregs in his flask, and the next, the cold steel of Wyatt's peacemaker was pressed against the back of his neck. The man froze, the flask slipping from his nerveless fingers. "We're going to have a talk." Wyatt's voice was a low growl, stripped of all warmth. He disarmed Cale and shoved him inside the dilapidated station. The single room smelled of decay and rat droppings. Wyatt kicked a crate over and forced Cale onto it. "The brand on your horses," Wyatt began, his voice calm but laced with menace. "The crow's foot. I know who used it." Cale's eyes darted around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't know what you're talking about." Wyatt cocked the hammer of his Colt. The sound, a sharp metallic click, echoed in the hollow stillness. "Try again." Cale swallowed hard. "It's just a brand." "Your boss," Wyatt pressed, moving closer, his shadow engulfing the smaller man. "He was at Blackwater Canyon, wasn't he?" At the mention of the name, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Cale's face. He started to shake his head, but Wyatt slammed his fist onto the wall next to the man's head, splintering the dry wood. His name, Wyatt, roared, the sound ripping from his throat, raw with years of suppressed fury. Cale broke. The bravado dissolved into whimpering terror. "Blackwood," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Silas Blackwood. He was there. He said you killed his family. Said you burned them alive." The name hit Wyatt like a physical blow. Silas Blackwood. He'd been the second in command of the smuggling ring, a man reported dead in the fire, his body supposedly burned beyond recognition. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. Blackwood hadn't died. He had survived, and he had spent the last 3 years nursing a festering, all-consuming hatred. The robbery hadn't been for money. The theft of the locket hadn't been a random taunt. It was all a meticulously planned overture to a symphony of revenge. And Alara. She was the chosen instrument of his torment. Wyatt's blood ran cold. He had not just brought danger to his door. He had led it to Alara. She wasn't a random victim he had stumbled upon. Blackwood must have found her, learned her story, and guided her toward that riverbank, knowing Wyatt's past would compel him to help her. He had been playing a game, and Wyatt had walked right into the trap. He left Cale tied up in the station with a gag in his mouth and rode back to the cabin like a man pursued by demons. The truth was a poison, sickening him with the realization of his own foolishness. He burst into the cabin to find Alara standing by the window, rifle in hand, her posture rigid with tension. She relaxed when she saw him, but the relief on her face quickly turned to concern as she saw the look in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. "What did you find out?" He sank into a chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. "This isn't about you, Alara," he said, his voice ragged. "It never was. You were bait." He told her everything. About Silas Blackwood, about the fire at Blackwater Canyon, about his own role in the death of Blackwood's family. He laid his guilt bare, the ugly, festering wound he had carried for 3 years. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, the room was thick with the weight of his confession. He expected to see fear in her eyes, or worse, revulsion. He expected her to back away from the man whose past had ensnared her in this nightmare. Instead, she crossed the room and knelt before him. She took his calloused, trembling hand in hers. "You made a mistake, Wyatt," she said, her voice soft but firm, devoid of judgment. "You didn't set that fire to kill his family. You are not the monster he wants you to be." Her absolution was a kindness he didn't feel he deserved. It broke through the armor of his guilt, and for the first time in years, he felt a crack in the dam of his grief. "He's using me to hurt you." She continued, her gaze unwavering. "That means he thinks I'm your weakness. We need to prove him wrong. We need to show him that I am your strength." In that moment, looking at her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp, Wyatt saw not a victim, but a survivor. Her courage was a fire that warmed the cold corners of his soul. He had taken her in to save her, but now he realized she might be the one to save him. The game had changed. Blackwood thought he was hunting a broken, solitary man. He was about to find out he was facing 2. Silas Blackwood, realizing the subtlety of his psychological warfare, was no longer effective, escalated his campaign of terror. The game of cat and mouse was over. The siege had begun. His first move was cruel and brutally effective. Under the cloak of darkness, his men rowed upstream from Redemption Creek and built a crude but sturdy dam across the narrowest point of the river, cutting off the town's primary source of water to a mere trickle. By morning, the town was in a panic. The creek bed, usually a gurgling artery of life, had dwindled to a muddy ditch. The water troughs were nearly empty, and the livestock bellowed with thirst. Fear, sharp and acrid, spread faster than a prairie fire. Wyatt rode into town to find chaos. Sheriff Miller was trying to organize a bucket brigade from the town's few deep wells, but it was a losing battle. Arguments were breaking out. Hoarding had begun. Silas's message was clear: this town's suffering is because of the man you harbor. Wyatt found Miller by the drying creek, his face grim. "This is Blackwood's doing," Wyatt said without preamble. "I know," Miller replied, not bothering to ask how Wyatt knew the name. "His men rode in an hour ago. Made an offer. They'll clear the dam if the town hands over you and the woman." The townspeople nearby overheard. Their fearful glances turned to open hostility. A blacksmith named Henderson, a large, usually gentle man, whose children Wyatt sometimes saw playing near his property, stepped forward. "He's right," Thorne Henderson said, his voice strained with worry for his family. "This is your fight. Why are you making it ours?" "Because Blackwood won't stop with me," Wyatt argued, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't used in years. "A man who would hold a whole town hostage over a grudge won't be satisfied with just revenge. He wants power. Give him what he wants now, and he'll own Redemption Creek forever." His words gave some of them pause, but fear was a more powerful motivator than reason. The crowd grew, their murmurs turning into a low growl of accusation. They were closing ranks, and he was on the outside. He had to force them to see him not as the cause of their problem, but as their only solution. He returned to his cabin that evening, feeling the full weight of the town's fear and resentment. He and Alara sat in a tense quiet, the knowledge that they were now truly alone, pressing in on them. "They're going to give us up." Alara said, her voice flat with resignation. "No," Wyatt said, a hard certainty in his tone. "I won't let them." He spent the night formulating a plan, and the mind of the U.S. Marshal he once was stirring from its long slumber. He couldn't fight Blackwood and his men alone, but he couldn't rely on the town for help either. He had to create a situation where they had no choice but to fight alongside him. The next day, Blackwood made his next move. He sent 2 of his men to Henderson, the blacksmith's home on the outskirts of town. They didn't draw their guns. They didn't need to. They simply sat on their horses in his yard, and their presence a suffocating threat to his wife and 2 small children. The message was personal now, and it was aimed directly at Wyatt through the town's most vulnerable. When word reached Wyatt, he knew his moment had come. He rode not to Henderson's, but straight to the center of town, where Sheriff Miller and the town council were holding a desperate meeting in the saloon. He strode through the swinging doors, and the room fell silent. "Blackwood has gone after Henderson's family," Wyatt announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "He's testing you. He wants to see if you'll sacrifice one of your own to save the rest." He looked from face to face, seeing the conflict, the fear, the shame. "You have a choice." He continued, his gaze locking with Sheriff Miller's. "You can hand over 2 strangers and pray that a man who starves a town and threatens children is a man of his word. Or you can make a stand. You can fight for your homes, for your families, for your future." He placed his hands flat on the table. "I know how he thinks. I know how to beat him. But I can't do it alone." A long, heavy silence followed. The men looked at each other, then at the sheriff. Miller, for his part, looked at Wyatt, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a disgraced outcast, but as a man offering a sliver of hope in a hopeless situation. It was Martha, the saloon owner, who broke the silence. She emerged from behind the bar, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. "The sheriff is right about one thing, Wyatt," she said, her voice like flint. "This town is spooked, but we're not cowards." She nodded toward the shotgun. "Tell us what to do." Her words were the spark. One by one, the men in the room began to nod. Henderson, who had come to the meeting, looked at Wyatt with a newfound respect. The town had been pushed too far. They were ready to fight back. Wyatt Thorne, the exile, had just become their reluctant commander. But even as he outlined his plan to ambush Blackwood's men and break the dam, a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He knew Silas. This was all too easy. This was just another move in a much deadlier game. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and a low guttural moan began to rise from the southwest. A dust storm was coming. The wind, which had been a restless whisper all day, was now whipping into a frenzy, tearing at loose shingles and sending tumbleweeds skittering down the main street like panicked animals. Wyatt's plan to ambush Blackwood's men at the dam was dead before it began. Nature had intervened, trapping them all. Everyone inside Sheriff Miller yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the gale. "Get to the saloon. The walls are thickest there." People scrambled for cover, shielding their faces from the stinging, sand-filled air. Wyatt grabbed Alara's hand and pulled her toward the swinging doors of Martha's saloon. They stumbled inside just as the full force of the storm hit. The world outside vanished into a swirling ochre-brown vortex. The howling of the wind was a physical force rattling the windows and making the very floorboards tremble. The saloon was crowded and dim-lit by a few flickering oil lamps that cast long dancing shadows. Wyatt, Alara, Sheriff Miller Martha Henderson and a dozen other townsfolk were packed together, their faces pale and anxious in the gloom. A grandfather clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each tick a hammer blow in the suffocating tension. "He'll use this," Wyatt said to Miller, his voice low and urgent. "The storm gives him cover. He'll hit us now." As if on cue, the front doors burst open, ripped from their hinges by the wind and a booted foot. Silas Blackwood stood on the threshold, his black duster whipping around him like a demon's wings. His men fanned out behind him, their faces covered with bandanas, their guns leveled. Panic erupted. A woman screamed. Henderson pushed his family behind him. But Silas raised a hand and an unnerving calm descended. "Please, no need for alarm," Silas said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind with chilling ease. He stepped inside his men, securing the door behind him. They were trapped. "This is merely a town meeting. And I have the floor." His eyes found Wyatt across the room. The predatory smile returned. "Hello, Marshal. I was hoping we could have a more public chat." He strolled to the center of the room, turning to address the terrified townsfolk. "My name is Silas Blackwood, and for 3 years I have dreamed of this moment. You see the man you've been protecting?" He pointed a long accusatory finger at Wyatt. "Is no hero. He is a butcher." He began to tell the story of Blackwater Canyon, his voice a mesmerizing blend of sorrow and venom. He painted a picture of a happy life, a wife he adored, a young son with his mother's eyes, all of it turned to ash by the righteous fire of Marshal Wyatt Thorne. He called it law enforcement. Silas spat, his voice cracking with theatrical grief. "I call it murder. He burned my world to the ground and walked away without a scratch." The townsfolk stared at Wyatt, their expressions shifting from fear to horror and accusation. They saw him now through Silas's eyes, a monster hiding behind a mask of quiet grief. Wyatt stood his ground, his face a stone mask, but inside his old guilt clawed at him. But simple revenge is so uninspired. Silas continued, his gaze drifting to Alara, who stood beside Wyatt, her hand gripping his arm. "I wanted you to feel what I felt, Wyatt. I wanted to take something you cherished and watch it burn." He took a step toward Alara. "And then I found this little lost bird. So perfect. So tragic." He suddenly turned his chilling smile on her. "Did you ever wonder, my dear, why your kind but weak husband Thomas took that job scouting for the Blackwater Canyon smugglers?" Alara's face went white. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, he was in deep," Silas said with relish. "Owed us a great deal of money. To pay his debt, he became an informant for Marshal Thorne. He was the one who fed Wyatt the bad information, who led him into the trap that killed my family." The saloon fell into a tense, listening quiet, the howling wind the only sound. Alara stared at Silas, then at Wyatt, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. Her entire life, her grief, her flight, it was all a lie, a stage play orchestrated by this man. "Your suffering has been a masterpiece, my dear," Silas purred. "The widow of the man whose betrayal cost me everything, delivered into the hands of the man who pulled the trigger. The poetry is simply sublime." He drew his pistol, the movement fluid and deadly, and pressed the cold barrel to Alara's temple. She flinched, but did not cry out. Her eyes filled with a universe of pain locked on Wyatt's. Silas turned his attention back to Wyatt, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. "And now for the final act. The moral dilemma. You have a choice, Marshal." He gestured with his free hand to the terrified townsfolk. "You can walk out that door. Leave Alara to me. I give you my word, I will let every last one of these good people go. Your atonement for my family will be paid with her life." He paused, letting the weight of the choice settle. Or he continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You can fight for her. You can try to be the hero you always pretended to be. And I will burn this saloon to the ground, with every man, woman, and child inside it. just like you did to my family. The clock on the wall ticked. The wind howled. Wyatt stood at the precipice of his own damnation. He could sacrifice the woman he had come to love to save the innocent, repeating his past failure on a smaller scale. Or he could fight for her and risk a massacre proving Silas's accusation true. It was an impossible choice, a perfect hellish trap designed to destroy not just his body, but his soul. The dust storm abated with the dawn, its fury spent. Pale, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy windows of the saloon, illuminating a scene of quiet devastation. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, spilled whiskey, and blood. The grandfather clock on the wall was silent, its glass face shattered. In the final desperate moments of the standoff, Wyatt had made his choice. He had not chosen sacrifice, nor had he chosen heroism. He had chosen humanity. With a single sharp nod to Sheriff Miller, a signal prearranged in the frantic moments before the storm hit, he had created a diversion. Miller had kicked over a table, drawing the fire of two of Silas's men. In that split second, Wyatt had lunged not at Silas, but at Alara, shoving her to the floor behind the heavy oak bar. The saloon had erupted into a whirlwind of violence. Gunfire shattered glass. Men shouted. Martha had fired both barrels of her shotgun from behind the bar. Henderson the blacksmith had wielded a broken chair leg like a club. It was chaotic, brutal, and swift. Now in the aftermath, Wyatt, a bloody gash on his forearm, knelt beside Alara. She was shaken, but unharmed. He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms. Around them, the townsfolk were tending to the wounded. Henderson had a broken arm, and two other men had been shot, but they would live. Silas's men were all dead, and Silas Blackwood himself was slumped against the far wall, a leg twisted at an unnatural angle, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He was alive, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His eyes, no longer filled with fire, were glazed with pain and disbelief. His perfect revenge had crumbled into ashes around him. Sheriff Miller limped over his face, etched with exhaustion and a new respect. "He's yours, Wyatt. Justice is yours to deliver." Wyatt looked at the broken man on the floor, the source of all his pain and the ghost that had haunted him for 3 years. The old Wyatt, the man ruled by grief and vengeance, would have drawn his gun and ended it. But he was not that man anymore. He looked at Alara, at the faces of the townsfolk who had fought beside him, and he knew that vengeance was a fire that consumed everything. Redemption lay in breaking the cycle. No, Wyatt said, his voice clear and steady. He'll face the law. The real law. He turned Silas over to the sheriff at the act of final rejection of the violence that had defined his past. Later, as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the recovering town, Wyatt and Alara sat on the edge of the saloon's porch. The silence between them was not awkward, but heavy with unspoken truths. "My husband." Alara began, her voice barely a whisper. He was part of it all along. The pain of the betrayal was a fresh, open wound. "He was a weak man who made a bad choice," Alara, Wyatt said gently. "His choices don't define you. What you did in there, the courage you showed. That's who you are." She looked at him, her eyes raw but clear. She was grappling with the truth of her past just as he had been. They were bound not just by the trauma they had shared, but by the understanding that the past does not have to be a prison. "And you?" She said, her fingers lightly touching the bandage on his arm. "You faced him. You didn't let him turn you into the monster he wanted you to be." He met her gaze, and in her eyes he saw not pity or admiration, but acceptance. She saw all of him, the broken marshal, the grieving husband, the quiet protector, and she was not afraid. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, amidst the wreckage of their pasts, they found a clean new space to begin again. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. Redemption Creek healed. The dam was dismantled, the creek ran full again, and the bullet holes in the saloon walls were plugged with fresh wood. The story of the siege became a local legend, and in that legend, Wyatt Thorne was no longer the town outcast, but its quiet, reluctant hero. The federal marshals had come for Silas Blackwood, taking him away to face a justice of prison cells and iron bars, a fate Wyatt knew was far more damning for a man like him than a quick bullet. The cabin on the edge of the Badlands was no longer a place of exile. It was a home. Laughter, a sound long absent, now echoed within its walls. Wyatt and Alara had built a life from the wreckage, their bond forged in fire and truth. One crisp morning, Wyatt saddled his horse. There was one last ghost he needed to lay to rest. He rode out to the small, windswept cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. He stopped before a simple wooden cross marked with a single name, Sarah Thorne. He dismounted, his movements slow and reverent. From his vest pocket, he pulled the silver locket which Sheriff Miller had recovered from Silas's body. He ran his thumb over the engraved S, the metal cool against his skin. For 3 years, this locket had been a symbol of his failure, a constant heavy reminder of all he had lost. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered to the wind, the words catching in his throat. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I let my grief become a prison. I thought honoring you meant never letting go of the pain." He paused, the silence of the prairie his only answer. "But I was wrong," he continued, his voice stronger now. "Honoring you means living. It means protecting others. It means letting myself be whole again." With a final gentle touch, he hung the locket over the top of the wooden cross. The silver gleamed in the morning sun, a small beacon of memory. He was not abandoning her. He was freeing them both. As he turned to leave, a profound sense of peace settled over him, a quiet he had not felt since before the fire. The weight he had carried for so long was finally lifted. He returned to the cabin to find Alara waiting for him on the porch, a soft smile on her face. She knew where he had been. She understood the journey he had needed to complete alone. The cabin behind her felt warm and alive, a testament to the future they were building. He walked up the steps and took her hands in his. Her smile widened, but her eyes held a new radiant light, a secret she was ready to share. "Wyatt," she said, her voice soft, but filled with a quiet joy. "There's something I have to tell you." She placed one of his hands on her stomach. "Our future. It's already begun." He stared at her, his mind slow to comprehend. Then understanding dawned, and a slow, genuine smile, the first of its kind in years, spread across his face. A child. A new life. A symbol of hope born from the ashes of their shared past. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it felt like the sunrise itself. They stood together on the porch, looking out as the morning light spilled across the rolling grasslands, washing the world clean. The wind carried not ghosts of the past, but the promise of a new day. Their future, once an uncertain and terrifying horizon, was now secure, bright, and filled with life.